sees and a heart to feel the things that God feels. And when you do that, then God will give you your mission. And when that happens, that's the coolest thing because your life really begins to make sense. Do you ever feel like your life lacks direction? Do you ever wonder what your purpose is? God doesn't want you to live like that. God wants you to know what that is, and He's ready to show that to you and to reveal that to you. And just like Nehemiah had this mission, this was probably his life's work, his purpose. And just as He gave Nehemiah that, He wants to give you that this morning if you're willing to have the eyes to see and a heart to feel. So that's really the big story of Nehemiah, of how God accomplishes His work through His people. And we know that, as we read from the first chapter last week, Nehemiah received word that Jerusalem was in ruin. Now, Nehemiah, again, just as a reminder, he was in Persia when this happened. He'd never actually been to Jerusalem because the people of God had been scattered around the world after the Assyrians defeated, after they came in and conquered Jerusalem, actually the Babylonians. And so he was living in Persia, 1,000 miles from Jerusalem. And when he heard about the destruction of the city, the walls being in ruin and the city in ruin, he fasted and he prayed, and he received an answer from God as to how to proceed. So again, he saw the need, he felt the need, he prayed, and he listened. What a great formula, right? It works the same way today, guys. So when God gives you a mission, guess what else God will do? He will put you in a very unique position to respond. And look, you can see this very clearly in the life of Nehemiah, and you'll be able to see it very clearly in the life of Esther, which we'll talk about next week. But Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king. Now, I want you to think about the relationship that a cupbearer would have to have with the king. Because he was the one that made sure that what the wine that the king drank, to make sure that it was safe, right? And so this is a person that would regularly put their own life on the line, because one of the main things that they would do in the ancient world, if you wanted to assassinate a king, you would find a way to poison his food or to poison his drink. And so he was the cupbearer, the one who was tasked with making sure that the king never drank wine that was poisoned. Well, how do you know? It's not like they had a chemistry set that they could run some tests on. The way that you discovered that was, well, you had to drink it, Tina. You had to drink it. And if it didn't kill you, then it must be okay for the king, right? And so the person who did this would have a very special relationship with the king. Imagine how you would feel about that person if a person was willing to do that for you. And oftentimes what would happen, that person, after they had been doing that for a period of time, they would have a pretty close bond with the king. And guess what else would happen? The king would begin to trust that person more than he trusted just about anybody else. So what a unique position Nehemiah was in to make a difference, right? That was the hand of God. That's the way God does things. He will put you in a unique position to respond. He'll give you a special gift, talent. He will equip you, and He will put you in a position to respond. And that is the coolest thing ever, when God does that and you know that that's what's happening. Well, that's what happened in the life of Nehemiah. And not only was he the cupbearer to the king, it's even more incredible than that. He was the stepson of Queen Esther. Now, if you're familiar with that story, which I won't get into that too much because that's what we're talking about next week, but Queen Esther, she was a Jew living in Persia, and she became the queen of Persia. Now, the king during the time of Queen Esther was King Xerxes. Well, King Xerxes was the father of King Artaxerxes, who was the king when Nehemiah was the cupbearer. And what you have to understand about it, and the Bible doesn't really, you have to kind of read between the lines a little bit sometimes. There was a lot of overlap between the people and the events that were going on during this time. And so we know that Queen Esther was able to have great influence on King Xerxes, and he became very sympathetic to the Jewish people. Artaxerxes was alive when that was happening, okay? He was probably a young adult when that was happening. And so Nehemiah and Esther, being Jews and being in the palace on such a regular occasion, they would have probably known each other and would have probably had some communication, right? I mean, I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but that is just the coolest thing to me. And so I believe that Artaxerxes, because of what happened in the Esther story, would have already perhaps had a little bit of sympathy towards the Jewish people, and also with Nehemiah being a Jewish man, even more so. So God uniquely positioned him to carry out this mission. And God does the same thing to you, by the way. Do you know that? Do you realize that this morning, that God does the same thing to you? Think about your life. Think about, I mean, a lot of times you don't realize it when you're going through it, but when you look back and you see how God uniquely positioned you, think about how you met your spouse. You know, I mean, there's just so many remarkable stories about how God brings people together to accomplish his work in the world. And guys, if you're a child of God, a believer in Jesus Christ this morning, there are no accidents. There are no coincidences. God is moving. And I want to tell you something else. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, because we're moving rapidly towards the end, guys, and there's a lot of things, there's a lot of people that need to hear the good news. And so God, he wants to use you to do that, to be a part of what he's doing in the world, and there's nothing more satisfying than that. So chapter 1 ends with Nehemiah having spent 4 months praying. He knows after fasting and praying for 4 months, he knows what he needs to do. He needs to go talk to the king. And that's what he does. Follow with me, chapter 2, beginning verse 1. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and I gave it to the king. We'll stop right there. So this is the perfect time. He's been waiting on the right time. And so here he is. He's going to give wine to the king. He's about to put his life on the line again for the king. What a great time to ask for a favor, right? Now, last week we discovered that Nehemiah waited 4 months. You may be asking, well, how do you know he waited 4 months? Well, if you look at verse 1, chapter 1, it was the month of Kislev, which is November or December. And if you go to chapter 2, verse 1, it's the month of Nisan when he actually goes to the king. And so that's March or April, and so that's how we get about 3 or 4 months' time. Now, here's something that I want you to also understand. Now, he waited for 4 months. And you may be sitting there thinking, okay, does that mean that every time God gives me a mission or a task that I need to wait for 4 months? No, that's not what we're talking. You got to understand something. This is a pretty big task. This is a mission. He's about to go 1,000 miles through enemy territory, and he's going to be in an area where a lot of people don't want him to be there doing what he's doing. And he's going to need a lot of supplies, stuff that he doesn't have. He's going to need a lot of help, and then God's going to really need to do some things, okay? I mean, this is an enormous project with many, many people being involved. And so there was some planning that needed to take place, right? So when God gives you a job this big, yeah, you probably do need to step back and spend some time praying and allow God to give you a plan. But there are so many other things that God puts on your heart to do that are just spontaneous things. You don't need to wait for 4 months to do those things, okay? Because all you would ever be doing is waiting. But you know what I'm talking about. There's a difference between those little things that we do day to day, you know? Those random acts of kindness. Those little things that we do to let people know that God loves them, whether it's a word of encouragement or something else that we're in a position to be able to do to help somebody. Those things go a long way. And you don't need to wait to do those things. But when it's your life's work, perhaps you need to pause. And you need to really spend some time seeking the voice of God. So when God gives you that type of a vision or a mission, a lot of times, man, you get excited and you want to get out and you want to start immediately. And Nehemiah wanted to start immediately too. He says in chapter 1, verse 11, he says, give your servant success today. It's like as soon as he got word of the ruins in Jerusalem, he wanted to do something now, Lord. Give me success today. But he didn't go before the king that very day. It was 4 months later. And so what we see here is that waiting is not necessarily wasted time. I like to say that it's being in God's waiting room. You ever been there? Being in the waiting room is not necessarily a bad thing to do. That's the time where God is preparing you. That's perhaps the time that God is giving you the plan. Now, the worst thing that we can do when it's a big mission and you get excited and you run ahead of God, oftentimes we flame out. I mean, we burn out real quick because we don't have the resources that we need. We ran ahead of God and we become discouraged and disillusioned. But God will oftentimes put you in that waiting room. Psalm 27:14 says, wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord. In Psalm 37:34, wait for the Lord and keep his way, and he will exalt you. And of course, Psalm 46:10 says, be still and know that I am God, or wait and know that I am God. So oftentimes God will do that, won't he? He'll put us in what we call the waiting room. And he's always, during that time, God is working behind the scenes. God is doing things that you're not aware of. And so we have to resist the urge to just go out there on our own and to try to make something happen. And so that's what Nehemiah does. He waits, and now it's time, and he takes the wine to the king. And it says that he had not been sad in the presence of the king before. So the king asked him, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of the heart. And then it says, I was very much afraid. So in some translations, it may say, a terrible fear came over me. Now, he was afraid. Now, why was he afraid? Because it was very dangerous to displease the king. And in the palace, you were not allowed to mourn. There were a lot of times what the Jewish people would do, they would put on sackcloth and cover themselves in ashes. That's what they would do when they would mourn, and that was illegal. You couldn't do that in the palace. You couldn't show sadness because the king had the authority to execute you right on the spot. He could do that. And so that gave him reason to really think about the seriousness of what was going on in that moment. But I think showing sadness was a part of God's plan because God used that. See, when God gives you a mission, Satan will oftentimes try to paralyze you. But what the devil intends for bad, God can use for good. And that's what we see here. A lot of times the devil will start giving you reasons why you can't do it, right? He'll make you feel, oh, it's too big a job. And you'll become overwhelmed, or he'll begin to remind you of your past, and you're like, oh man, I've done this and I've done that. God can't use me in any kind of special way. He'll make you think that you're too weak, or you're not smart enough, you're not this or you're not that. And that's what the devil will do, to try to discourage you, to keep you from carrying out the work of the Lord. But fortunately, Nehemiah's faith was greater than his fear. Now you can imagine months of praying and fasting had prepared him for this very moment. And so he was filled with courage. He was filled with courage. Now you think, well, he was afraid. Now how was that being courageous? Well, what is courage? Excuse me. You tell me, what is courage? Is courage never being afraid? Is that what courage is? You cannot, here's the thing, you cannot be courageous without fear. Do you know that? You can't have courage without a little fear. Because courage is actually carrying on even when you're afraid. It's working through that and not allowing that fear to paralyze you, but you're going to continue to step. You're going to continue to trust God. Even though you have some fear, you're going to still continue to carry out the mission. Now, I can imagine after spending 4 months of praying and fasting, how he would have been filled with the Spirit of God. I mean, there are times that I get a little bit, toss it up. Oh, put the cap back on first, thank you. That would have been good, wouldn't it? So 4 months of praying and fasting. I mean, how Spirit-filled he must have been after praying and fasting for 4 months. There are times that I get a little bit spiritually dry. You ever needed to just kind of be reset spiritually? You allow busyness or some sin to kind of get in there, and it kind of wreaks havoc with your spiritual life. You know, am I the only one? Please tell me I'm not. That happens to me. And when that happens to me, I realize that what I have done wrong is I usually have gotten away from the Word of God. Because I normally have this routine of getting up in the morning and I'm in the Word. I have a time of prayer and meditation. But when I kind of get off track a little bit, that's usually the thing that goes. Things just start to speed up in my life, and I'll get up and I'll feel anxious when I get up, and I feel like, well, I've just got to get out the door. I just got to get going, and I don't take the time to do those things that I need to do to be spiritually healthy, and pretty soon things begin to unravel. It's amazing to me when I realize that, and thank God, as I've gotten older, I realize that that's my problem a lot sooner than I used to. I used to go a long way down that road before I realized what my problem was. Now that I'm older, I realize that that's my problem almost immediately, and I'm like, okay, I need to get recentered. So I'll get up the next morning, and I'll get back on track. And it's amazing to me that I do that just one morning, and really focus on the Lord and really meditate on His Word. How just that one morning, just that, I don't know, maybe a half hour, how that just fills me with the Spirit of God. And it changes my perspective, it changes my attitude, and I'm ready to go. Can you relate to that? Imagine 4 months. Imagine 4 months of praying and fasting and just being committed, not just for 30 minutes, but I mean like almost all day, every day. I'm sure he had things that he had to accomplish in his job, but the way that this is written, it's like he was doing this all the time. It's like a special time that he set apart to prepare himself and to hear the voice of God. And so he would have been ready to go, Scott. He's ready to go. He's locked and loaded, man. He's ready to do this. And so verse 3, he says to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Now, the first thing he does, I would imagine, guys, he's being completely led by the Spirit at this point, don't you? First thing he does is he affirms the king. That's a pretty smart thing to do before you ask somebody for a favor, right? And then he begins to tell the king what the problem is. You know, another wise thing that he does here is he doesn't mention, if you look at this, he doesn't mention the name of the city, which is Jerusalem, of course. He refers to it as the city where my ancestors are buried. That's interesting. Now, that's smart, too, and I would imagine, again, being led by the Spirit, because what he's doing here when he says that, he's finding common ground with the king. Because the city of Jerusalem wouldn't have meant really anything to the king. He may have been familiar with it, but he didn't really care about the city of Jerusalem. But when he says the city where my ancestors are buried, that would have meant something, because the Persian people, I mean, they were all about their dead ancestors. They actually even worshiped their dead ancestors. And so when he puts it this way, he finds some common ground with the king, because they had such great respect for ancestors. And then the king replies to him, what is it that you want? So here he rightly assumes that Nehemiah wanted to take action. I think he rightly knew perhaps the Spirit of God was working on him too, right? And I think the Spirit of God had probably already worked on him prior to this conversation and softened his heart and prepared him for this moment as well, even though he probably didn't realize it, that that's what was happening. So God, again, working behind the scenes, putting the pieces in place, setting things up. And then look at the second part of verse 4. He says, then I prayed to the God of heaven. So there he is. He's standing there before the king. And the king says, what is it that you want? And then he says, I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. Now, think about it. I don't know, did God make time stand still for a second? Because there he is. He's standing there. And the king is asking him a question. And you need to reply pretty quickly. You're not going to just stand there. Well, no, hang on, king. Let me just pray about it for a minute. No, he needed to answer the king. I don't know if time stood still or if he was just doing some instant messaging with God right there in the moment. I don't know. It's almost like, God had been such a part of his life for the past 4 months, and he was in such constant communication with God that he was able to, just in that moment, he was able to just say, okay, Father, okay, God, here's the opportunity, here's the time. What do you want me to say? Do you know you can do that? You can do that. What does it tell us in Scripture? It says pray without ceasing, right? That's kind of what it's talking about. Not making prayer just this thing that you do, but you can be in constant communication with God, knowing that he's there everywhere that you go, and asking him not just about big things, but small things. And so he had that kind of a relationship with God after spending 4 months praying and fasting and meditating. It just became a natural response. And then he says, in verse 5, he says, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city of Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it. Now, it's a pretty bold request, because if you go back and read Ezra, you see that the king, this very king, had issued a policy some years earlier where they had to stop rebuilding the city. Now, they had gone and they had rebuilt the altar, and they had begun offering sacrifices at the altar. They had rebuilt the temple, and then they started rebuilding the city. And then there were some enemies of the Jewish people that were there, and they sent a false report to the king. They wrote the king a letter, King Artaxerxes. They wrote him a letter and said that these are rebellious people. If you allow them to rebuild this city, you're just asking for trouble. They're just going to rebel against you again. And so the king, in response to that, sent out a decree and basically told them to stop rebuilding the city. Ezra 4:21. Now issue an order to these men to stop work so that this city will not be rebuilt until I so order. And so Nehemiah knew about that. He knew that it was going to take an act of God to get the king basically to change his mind, right? He's trying to get the king to reverse a policy. Here's a really important thing that you need to understand. When God calls you to do something big in your life, you got to be willing to ask for help. There's a lot of you out there who are a lot like me. You just want to do it yourself. And I want to tell you, that just doesn't work. God doesn't call us to be lone rangers. God accomplishes his work with teams. People working together, coming together. And sometimes I want to tell you, when it's a big job, you got to ask big. You got to be bold when you ask for help. And here he puts his fear aside, and he went to the one person who was in a position to do more than anybody, and he begins to ask the king for help. And what we see is that God had gone before, and God was preparing the way. And when that happens, guys, sometimes you will be shocked, you'll be surprised at the people who are willing to help you. And sometimes you'll be surprised at how far they're willing to go to help you. He says, verse 6 says, the king with the queen sitting beside him asked me, how long will your journey take and when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. So the king here, he grants instant permission. Instantly, he gives him permission to go on this journey. And Nehemiah ended up staying for 12 years. So it wasn't like it was a quick trip. In verse 7, he says this. Remember I said, ask big, be bold? Well, here we go. It's not just asking for permission. God had been speaking to him. God said, when you go before the king, this is what's going to happen, and this is what you need to ask for. So here we go. He says, I also asked him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent an army. He sent army officers and a cavalry with me. That's amazing. Look at what this king is willing to do for him. It's even more than he was asking for. So 4 months of praying and fasting resulted in this God-ordained step-by-step plan. Prayed and fasted. And he was talking to the king to ask for his help. He got the letters to guarantee safety. He's making arrangements for timber. So God had given him this mission, and God gave him the plan. And look, sometimes it may not go exactly like this. God doesn't always give you all the details at once. And look, there were still a lot of things that he didn't know. There were still a lot of other things he was going to need. But this is a good start, right? This is a really good start. But God will always do at least one thing: give you the next step. If you take one step in faith, God will give you the next step, right? He'll shine enough light on your path so you can see the next step and the next step. And that's really what we do, is we just take one step in faith at a time when we're following God, right? And then we look back and we're like, wow, how far I've come. But sometimes God will give you multiple steps. And that's what he does with Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah, he understood the importance of prayer, right? But he also understood the importance of planning. And I want you to know, when you're carrying out a God-sized task, it's not just one or the other. It's not just prayer or planning. It's both. You got to pray and you got to plan. God has to be in the plan. God has to be the one that's giving the orders, that's giving you the steps. Some people just plan. Some people just pray. And it never works when you just do one and not both. So fulfilling God's purpose requires both of those things. Now, there's a few things here I want you to see in the things that he asked for. In verse 7, it says, I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. So here's what we know about that. He expected opposition, right? He expected trouble. Well, how did he know? Well, he knew because Ezra had trouble when he went. And when a man named Zerubbabel went before that to actually start rebuilding the temple, before Ezra went, there was trouble. There was always trouble because there were people all around that area that did not want them to do this work. They did not want the Jewish people, God's chosen people, didn't want them to become powerful again because now they were in control. And they didn't want to relinquish their control back to these people who they knew the hand of God was upon them. And so they wanted to stop them from accomplishing that work. So he expects opposition. And I want you to know, when you try to do something for God, you better expect the same thing. You better expect opposition, because there are always going to be people that are just pawns of the devil that are going to try to stop you. You have to expect it. And when you expect it, you won't be surprised by it, and you'll be prepared. It says, verse 10, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, these are people who were in opposition. These are Samaritans. These are people that were there. They were enemies of the Jewish people, the chosen people of God. They were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. Now, we'll talk more next time we get into this about these two characters. But Nehemiah expected opposition, and so what does he do? He gets the king to write these letters. Now, these letters, whenever he got there, he would have provided these guys with these letters, and so if they were to oppose Nehemiah, guess what they're also doing? They're opposing the king. And that's not very recommended, is it? You don't want to oppose the king. Very smart. Nehemiah knew what he was doing here. God was directing him step by step. And he says in verse 8, "And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so that he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel, by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy." So Nehemiah had done his homework here. He knew who was in charge of the lumber. He knew who was in charge of the timber. Now, what you got to understand, in the ancient world, in this area, there's not a lot of trees, and so timber was a very precious commodity. It was pretty scarce. And so what we see here, God's doing his part, Nehemiah's doing his part. We see a partnership between the two, and that's what it takes to carry out God's work. And it says the second part of verse 8, "And because the gracious hand of God was on me, the king granted my request." So he hasn't forgotten who's in charge, right? He's not forgetting where the power is coming from. Look, sometimes when we start having some success, we can start thinking that we're doing something. Oh, it's because of me. But he knows that it's just because of God. He knew that without God, that none of this would be taking place, that his efforts would be in vain. And so it says, verse 9, it says, "So when I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters, the king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me." That's probably the part of the story that I like the most, because God sent an army with him. You see that? He didn't ask for that. He was just asking for a letter, give me a piece of paper that gives me permission and says that I have your authority, the permission to carry out this work. Well, the king said, "Okay, I'll give you that, but I'm also going to send an army with you, just in case." Man, that's amazing, isn't it? And that should fire you up, that when God calls you out to do something, he's going to send an army with you, man. He's going to protect you. He's going to give you everything that you need. It still works the same way. Guys, again, there's a lot of things that need to be done. Much work to be done. We are racing rapidly towards the end of human history, and it's an exciting time to be a follower of God. It's such an exciting time. Some people say it's a scary time. Well, if that's the way you want to look at it, well, then look at it that way. But it's an exciting time because God wants to use you. Because there's so much that needs to be done, and we get our eyes off of the world and we really get our eyes on him. And he's going to speak something to your heart. He's going to give you a mission, and you're going to know it because it's going to be different than anything else that you've ever felt in your life. And then you're going to know, because you're going to remember this story, that if God calls you to do it, then he's going to give you everything that you need. You've got to take time to see it. You've got to take time to feel it. You've got to spend time praying, not talking to God, but listening to God. You got to share it with others, because when God gives you a mission, he gives you a plan. Guess what? He's working behind the scenes, and he's preparing other people too to be a part of what he's called you to do. And so we partner together and we get the work done, and we are not afraid to ask for help, because God, even it may not even be people that are believers, but God will still press upon someone's heart to help you, to do things for you. That they may be willing to do things for you that are beyond what you even ask for, because God is in it. And then we just simply trust God. God's gonna see it through. Amen. Father, we thank you so much for this reminder of what it looks like to be called by you to carry out our life's work, our mission, Father, the vision that you give us, Father, to go out and to participate with you in the work that you're doing in this world. God, etch this to our hearts and help us to remember it as we leave this place. And God, help us to realize that you're always with us, that you don't call us to do things alone, that you are always with us. But even beyond that, Lord, you're going to give us other people. You're going to give us partners in the work that you've called us to do. And together, Lord, we'll carry out your mission, your plan. In Jesus' name, amen. We're going to take just a moment. We call this vertical time, and we're going to do that this morning. And if you're new here, this is just a moment where we just reflect upon what we've heard, and that way we're not just running out of this place and forgetting it quickly. Sometimes that can happen. So think about your own life. Think about where you're at during this time. And maybe you know what that is. Maybe you know what God's called you out to do, and you have God to show you what the next step is. And if you've just been too busy, too preoccupied with your own life, and you haven't seen it, and you don't really know, your life doesn't make sense because you don't really know what your purpose is, ask God to help you to just change that so that you can care about the things that God cares about. And once you start doing that, that's really when it begins to come into focus. And so regardless of which one you might be today, just take some time and just reflect, just a few moments long, and then we'll dismiss the service. Definitely better than it was. South Carolina for a men's retreat. You guys know I've been doing this for 10 years, and I'm excited because it's the first time I'm taking somebody from our church with me. And so we're excited about that. We're going to have an opportunity to minister to, I think there's 26 of us this time, so it's a good group of men that we're going to have some good fellowship with. We'll be down there for, I guess, Monday through Friday, not this week, but next week. So be praying, that God will use us when we go down there. I'm excited about going again. This summer, I don't have a date yet, but I'm really excited about an event that we're going to do, probably at Kefauver Park. It's going to be a big outreach event. It's called Beef and Bibles. Yes, Beef and Bibles. It's going to be really cool. We're still kind of working on some of the details, but Justin and Jess, it's an idea that they had. It was something they did at their church in California. They told me about it, and I said, man, that is just so cool. We got to do that. We're basically going to have a big cornhole tournament, which, people in East Tennessee, they're all about their cornhole, right? So we're going to have a cornhole tournament. We're going to have brisket and what other kind of beef are we going to have? Brisket and what? Say it again. Okay. Yeah, and we're gonna have hot dogs and hamburgers for kids. Our worship team is going to be there. They're going to play some music. There'll be a very brief message, but just an opportunity to interact with people that are at the park that day. I've got to call and reserve a day. I'm not sure what's available yet, but hopefully we can get a good day. We're looking at probably July, maybe doing it not first part of August, but I'm looking forward to that. That's going to be a lot of fun. Another thing that is about to happen, this is really cool. We've been a church we're in our 17th year. After Easter, we entered into year 17 of a church, and that's exciting. But you know what we've never had? In 17 years, we've never had a permanent sign. I mean, can you believe that? In 17 years as a church, we've just got these temporary signs, and there's that big hole that's up there above the State Farm sign over here. That's about to change, folks. We're about to get us a new sign over here, and we're getting one on this end of the building. So people will know. I can't tell you how many people have said, I didn't know there was a church there. And I'm like, well, gosh, and there's only been a church here for 20 years, and we've been here for 7 years, but I'm excited about that. Just a lot of things going on. And hey, here's something that you can pray about. If you want to participate in helping us pay for those two signs, because, man, believe it or not, it's going to cost some money to do that. But, the cool thing is the guy who's doing it, God put us in a neighborhood. The guy who lives across the street from me, he owns a sign company. Go figure. God uniquely positioned him and gifted him to help us. And so guess what I did? I boldly went across the street. I said, hey, I need some help. I heard you own a sign company. So he's the guy that's doing it. He's a good dude, and he's really helping us out a lot with the cost. So we're excited about that. There's just a lot of different things going on. Am I missing anything? There's something else that's not in the worship folder that I was supposed to tell people about. Huh? Oh yeah, we're getting a mural on the side of the building. That's just a big blank spot over there. We're going to paint that thing white. And we're going to put in big, black, bold letters, love God, love people, embrace the journey. And people will be able to see that from 411. Really, really cool. Yard sale! Oh my gosh! How did I forget the yard sale? Sorry if I startled you there. I'm just like that about yard sales. We're going on vacation the first week of July. I tried to get them to do the yard sale that week, but they wouldn't do it that week. So I believe it's June 10th. Is that right? June 10th. Mark your calendars. So how can you help with the yard sale? Well, on June 10th, you can come and help us. That's one thing that you can do. Another thing you can do is start bringing stuff that you don't want. Okay, don't bring junk. Don't bring stuff nobody else wants. We don't want clothes. We're not going to deal with clothes. Okay, we're just not going to do it. But if you've got, some old furniture items are awesome at yard sales. Man, people will buy that stuff But if you want to start bringing stuff, you can contact me. I'm usually here on Mondays. I'm here all day on Wednesday. I mean, obviously you can bring stuff on Sunday, and we can take it over to the door on the side where the the garage door, yeah, that thing, and we can start collecting stuff. We've already got a lot of stuff collected over there, but we're going to do that this summer. I think our praise team, or worship team, they're going to set up and do some music. We're going to do some other fun stuff during that time. So that'll be yard sale / community outreach. Okay, so that's going to be fun too. We'll probably fire the grill up, do some hot dogs and hamburgers, but anyway, so we'll make it fun as a yard sale can be. Yeah, you're thrilled, I can tell. But it'll be a good day. Okay, well, stand up and let me properly release you. Did you have something, Larry? You were over there waving your arms at me. Yeah, I don't know when the next one's going to be. We had this community where multiple churches came together last Sunday evening over at 411 Chapel. We had a great time of worship with those folks. I don't know when the next one's going to be, but I'll let you know. We had a good little group of people from our church that went. We had a good time with them, and we'll look forward to whenever that happens again. It's going to be a once a month thing. I'm not sure, but I'll let you know. All right. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you. May he be gracious unto you all and give you peace. God bless you all. Your release.